All right, this video is going to talk about consumer and producer surplus. This is a topic from chapter 5. It has some numbers up here and a graph, and we'll go through both the definition of these terms and then how to find them on the graph. So consumer surplus is defined as the difference between a person's willingness to pay for a good and how much they have to pay to purchase it. And what we first want to do is we have a demand schedule and a supply schedule here. And the first one we want to do is we want to consider this demand schedule again, because it actually is going to have the willingness to pay for this good on here. So when we first introduced the demand schedule in chapter 3, we would say, for instance, the demand schedule tells you at a price of $14, consumers want to buy 1 unit of the good. At a price of $10, consumers want to buy 3 units of this good. Okay, let's ask a different question now. If we look at this number here, this demand schedule, could we ask the question, how much is 1 unit worth to the consumer or consumers that are reflected here in this demand curve? Well, at a price of $16, the quantity demanded is 0. So we'd have to say if consumers are being rational in their choice to purchase this good, so think about what we talked about in chapter 16. If consumers are being rational in their purchase of the good, well, they'd have to be saying at a price of $16, this good isn't worth buying at all. They'd prefer to keep $16 than to spend it on this good. At $14, the quantity demand becomes 1. So that first unit of the good has to be worth at least $14 to some consumer. They showed that they were willing to spend $14 to get it. They went to a store, they were willing to take $14 out of their wallet, and they gave $14 and got 1 unit of the good. So presumably this good is worth at least $14, but we know it's not worth $16 because they weren't willing to buy it at $16. Let's consider the second good, the second unit of this good. A second unit of this good can't be worth $12, or it can't be worth $14. I'm sorry, it is going to be worth $12. It can't be worth $14 because if a second unit of the good was worth $14, then the quantity demanded at 14 would be 2, but it's only 1. So a second unit couldn't be worth $14, but the quantity demanded goes to 2 at 12. And that means that a second unit of the good must have been worth at least $12 to some consumer out there. They were willing to pay $12, but they weren't willing to pay $14. For the third unit, we could say, well, it's got to be worth at least $10 because they're willing to buy it at a price of $10, but they weren't willing to buy it at a price of $12. So it's got to be worth between $10 and $12 and so forth down here. Well, I've got the points of the demand curve drawn up here. And what we'll just do is we'll sort of like round it off and say this first unit of the good, I got a dot pointed at 1 and 14. We'll say that first unit of the good is worth $14. It could be a little bit more, but we'll sort of round off. Say, okay, it's $14. We'll have that there. A second unit of the good has to be worth $12. Well, again, rounding off a little bit, we'll just say it's worth $12. The third unit of the good is worth $10, and so forth down the demand curve. So our demand schedule also really gives us willingness to pay, how much a person would be willing to pay for the good, the maximum they'd be willing to pay. Again, this person would be willing to pay 14, they would pay 16, so we know they're willing to pay at least 14. So, and again, we rounded it off and called it 14. So we're going to draw the demand curve in here. And again, we know that the height of the demand curve is giving us the willingness to pay for each unit. So if we want to, we could sum this up. We could sum first unit is worth 14, second unit worth 12, and so the fourth down here would be summing up. Well, if instead of taking units here, what we could do is we'll say we could take the area under the demand curve. It makes it a little smoother. So the area under the demand curve is going to give us the willingness to pay of consumers for all of the goods. The total area under the demand curve is the total willingness to pay, and the height of the demand curve is the marginal willingness to pay, the willingness to pay for 1 more unit of the good. Now let's go to the next thing. Well, if we have a market like this, then we would say, well, we have to see what the equilibrium price is going to be. And hopefully when we're looking at a demand and supply schedule like this, you should be able to tell, like, okay, yeah. $8 is the price where the quantity demanded equals the quantity supplied. So that's going to be the equilibrium price. So if all units of this good are selling for $8, so consumers are able to go in and buy 4 units of the good for $8 a piece. Well, suppose you're this person here who valued that first unit of the good worth $14. It was something that was worth $14 for you, but in equilibrium, you only have to pay $8 to buy it. You get something that was worth $14 for you for $8. You actually have some surplus value. That's what we mean by the consumer surplus. It's going to be the difference between the person's willingness to pay for the good and how much they end up having to pay for it. So if on the second unit of the good, you have a consumer surplus of $4. The first unit of the good, you had a consumer surplus of $6. And what that is that's going to be, graphically, that's going to be the area that's below the demand curve and above the price line. So it would look something like this. We'll call that CS as consumer surplus. It's going to be the area that's below the demand curve and above the price. If the demand curve is linear, then happens to be the case that this consumer surplus area would be exactly a triangle. And we could, if you wanted to, I could give you questions to find the area of that triangle, 1/2 the base times height, but we won't do that in this class. Okay, now let's consider producer surplus. Producer surplus, well, and we want to go back to the supply curve and think about the supply curve again. The supply curve, well, it would say how much would suppliers have to receive to supply some of this good? Well, we see down here at a price of $4, the quantity supplied is 0. Okay, so that means that $4 is not enough to get anybody, any producer, to supply even a single unit of this good. But at a price of $6, they're willing to supply two units of the good. So the first 2 units of the good, well, they must receive a price that's that's bigger than $4, but somewhere between $4 and $6, and then they'd be willing to supply 2 units of the good to the market. So we can actually look at this supply curve, and I have the dots over here, and to draw it in. We have a supply curve here, and the supply curve would really be a willingness to supply. The height of the supply curve is telling us the willingness of suppliers to supply this good. So we can really do, let me write this down, the WTS, a willingness to supply. And then on the demand side, we could say, well, the demand curve is giving us the willingness to pay. Well, if this product sells for a price of $8, we'll consider the suppliers who supplied those first 2 units of the good to the market. They would have been willing to supply them for $6. They get to sell them for $8. They're getting a surplus or a bonus as well. And that's what we'll call this, the producer surplus. The producer surplus is going to be the difference between the price of the good and the willingness of suppliers to supply the good. Willingness to supply could also be thought of as the minimum price you'd have to be paid to supply a given unit of the good to the market. And an upward sloping supply curve from the law of supply would be telling us to get producers to be willing to supply more units of the good to the marketplace. The price that's going to get paid has to go up. And that price would have to go up because the willingness to supply will start to rise. We put the producers with the lowest willingness to supply here on the bottom part of the supply curve. And as we go up, we've got producers or producers for those units. They would need to receive a higher price. They have a higher willingness to supply. So producer surplus then can be defined as the difference between the price that producers sell the good for and their willingness to supply. It's the difference here. This is the price is going to be higher than the willingness to supply. So you think of the price minus the willingness to supply. On the graph here, that's going to turn out to be the area that would be below the price and above the supply curve. The higher the supply curve is giving us the willingness to supply. So this area in here would be the producer surplus. There's a hatchet area on it. It's again, it's the area that's below the price. Think about a horizontal line here at the equilibrium price. The area that's below that price and above the supply curve is the producer surplus. So now we have two important concepts, producer surplus and consumer surplus. And this is going to be important because in the next video, we'll talk about how we can use producer and consumer surplus to think about efficiency in markets and the gains from trade. So that's consumer and producer surplus.